A mountain man named Hugh Glass was hunting up in the Grand River country of what is now South Dakota when a grizzly bear came out of a thicket and mauled him near to death. His own party thought he was finished. They dug his grave right there beside him, and then they left him before he was even in it. That is the only reason we know his name today, neighbor, because Hugh Glass was not done yet. He crawled and staggered 200 miles back to Fort Kiowa on a broken leg over the next 6 weeks, and for most of those weeks he had no rifle and no knife. And all the food that kept him alive was under $2. He ate rose hips off the bush and wild onion out of a creek bank. He chewed the raw root of a cattail plant whenever he came across slow water, and somewhere near the end of that crawl a Sioux band gave him a small pouch of parched corn. The food that kept him breathing was not some strange trick. It was the everyday supper of every farmhouse from Kentucky down through Georgia for the next 130 years, and it fed families of 6 through the worst winter of the Great Depression on about $1.50 a week. That food was cheap, and it was old, and it is mostly forgotten now, and I promise you there is more nourishment in $2 of it than in a full grocery cart of what most families are eating tonight. I have got 22 of those old poor man meals for you. 22 suppers a fella can put on his own table this week for less than $2 a plate, and every one of them fed a working mountain man, harder work than most of us will ever do. Number 9 is a 2-ingredient breakfast cake that fed Jim Bridger for 6 full weeks in country. A modern man would not last 6 days in, and you can put a batch of them on a hot pan for about 40 cents a serving. Number 3 is a tea your great-grandmother drank every morning of her life, growing free in the ditch beside your driveway right now, that got the whole Confederacy through the blockade when the coffee ships stopped coming. And number 1 is one that I bet you've never heard about before. My name is Amos Calder. I'm 6th generation on this ridge, and my people came up out of the Carolina backcountry in the 1780s and never left it. My grandfather Eben raised me from the time I was 6 years old, and before he passed, he made me copy his food ledger into a notebook of my own. Eben started that ledger the 4th of October 1935, the morning the mill down in the valley shut its doors for 11 weeks. 6 mouths in the house that winter, and no money coming in for any of them. My grandmother Ada fed all 6 of them 3 meals a day on about $1.50 a week, and my father told me before he passed that he did not know until he was a grown man that the family had ever been broke. If you are new around here, hit that subscribe button before we go any further. Not for my sake. It is just that once you have seen one of these old meals, you are going to want the next one. We are counting down all 22 of them in order, starting with the pantry staples you can put on your own table this week for pocket change, and working our way down to the one meal that changes how a fellow looks at every grocery cart in America afterward. Know your local foraging rules before you pick anything wild off the ground, and if you have never eaten a plant out of the woods before, learn it from a person who knows it in real life before you learn it from anyone on the internet, myself included. The reason Hugh Glass survived those 6 weeks was not any single food he ate. It was that he knew what to reach for first when there was nothing else. And that is exactly where we are starting. Number 22 is a cornmeal Johnny cake cooked on a flat rock leaned up against the fire. Cornmeal, water, a pinch of salt, and a hot pan. And a fella has a supper he can wrap in a cloth and carry in his pack for 2 days without it going bad on him. Your grandfather knew that a pound of cornmeal was the cheapest calorie a body could carry into hard country, and that a Johnny cake made with a spoonful of lard rubbed onto the pan was hotter and more filling than any 3 slices of white bread a grocery store would sell him today. The Foxfire books wrote the ratio down almost exactly the way Ada made it. 1 cup of cornmeal to 2/3 of a cup of boiling water, and a pinch of salt worked in with the back of a spoon. Cost you today about 15 cents a cake. Your one thing this week is to stir a cup of cornmeal into 2/3 of a cup of boiling water with a pinch of salt, lay a spoonful on a hot pan, and taste what a 200-year-old supper tastes like standing at the stove. Number 21 is a pot of dried beans set to soak the night before and simmered slow all the next day. Your grandfather knew that a 5-pound bag of pintos could feed 4 grown men for 2 full days on about $1 worth of beans, and that dropping a 2-inch chunk of salt pork into the pot for the last hour turned a poor man's supper into something a working fellow could sit down to without complaint. The fur brigades on the Missouri in the 1830s packed dried beans second only to flour, because a bean was the cheapest protein a man could put in a boat. Cost you today about 30 cents a plate, and Ada fed the whole household on a pot like that every Wednesday and every Sunday across those 11 weeks. Your one thing this week is to soak a cup of pintos overnight, simmer them 4 hours with a small piece of salt pork and half an onion, and eat a bowl for supper with cornbread on the side. Number 20 is salt pork and fatback out of the crock in the smokehouse. 2 ounces of salt pork in a pot of beans, or 3 strips of fatback laid across a skillet of greens, turned near-starvation food into a supper a working man could stand up from. Your grandfather knew that salt pork was calories, salt, fat, and shelf life all packed into one white slab, and that a pound of it lasted a family a full week when you cut it small and stretched it across other food instead of eating it by itself. Lewis and Clark carried barrels of salt pork up the Missouri in 1804 and ate off those barrels the whole way to the Pacific and back. A pound today runs you about $4, and it will flavor 30 separate meals for a family of 6 if you make it stretch the way Ada did. Your one thing this week is to buy a pound at the meat counter, cut 2 small pieces off it every time you cook beans or greens for the next 2 weeks, and see how long 1 pound actually lasts you. Number 19 is a pot of white rice cooked in salted water and served with a spoonful of whatever fat is in the house. Your grandfather knew that rice was the cheapest hot supper on earth by weight, and that a cup of dry rice with 2 cups of water and a pinch of salt made a plate for 4 hungry people on about a dime's worth of rice. The Hudson's Bay Company traded rice up the whole Columbia River through the 1830s because a burlap sack of it stayed edible for 10 years in a dry storehouse. Ada served rice with a spoonful of bacon grease stirred in and a piece of sausage laid on top 3 nights a week that winter, and every plate cost her about 2 cents. Cost you today about 10 cents a plate. Your one thing this week is to cook a plain pot the way your great-grandmother did. 1 cup of rice to 2 cups of boiling salted water, covered tight and left alone for 18 minutes, and eat a plate with nothing on top but a spoonful of bacon grease. Number 18 is a crock of rendered lard kept on the back of the stove and used a spoonful at a time for every meal that came out of that kitchen. Your grandmother rendered a pound of pork fat down over low heat until it turned clear and golden, then strained it into a stoneware crock and set it in the cool part of the pantry where it kept for 6 months without ever going bad on her. Nessmuk, who wrote Woodcraft in 1884 and taught 2 generations of American boys how to camp, called rendered fat the single most important item a fellow could keep in his pantry, because a spoonful of it turned a plain piece of bread into a supper and a plain pot of beans into a meal. Your grandfather knew that lard cost less than butter, held up in heat where butter burned, and made every biscuit and every pie crust and every fried egg better than any substitute a grocery store has invented since. Cost you today about 5 cents a meal at any store that still sells it, and about nothing at all if you render your own from the trim you get free at the meat counter when you ask nicely for it. My grandfather rendered a fresh crock of lard every fall of his life, and Ada made the biscuits every Sunday morning of hers with a spoonful lifted straight out of that crock. Your one thing this week is to buy a small tub of leaf lard at the grocery store and use a spoonful of it in place of butter or oil for 1 whole day of cooking, and see the difference in every single thing you put in the pan. Number 17 is a spoonful of blackstrap molasses poured over a hot piece of cornbread and eaten standing up at the kitchen counter. Molasses was the frontier's sugar, and it was the Frontier's iron supplement, and it was the Frontier's morale booster, all sitting in the same brown jar on the shelf. A tablespoon of it on a piece of cornbread was breakfast for half the children in the Appalachian Mountains, straight through the 1930s and 40s. Your grandfather knew that a jug of molasses cost less by weight than any refined sugar, and that molasses carried more iron and more potassium and more good minerals in one spoonful than a whole pound of white sugar carried in a 5-pound bag. Ada gave every child in the house a tablespoon of molasses stirred into a cup of warm milk every morning of that winter, and my father grew up believing that particular breakfast was a treat rather than the poor man's tonic it actually was. Cost you today about 10 cents a serving at any grocery store, and about $1 for a jar that will last a family a full month. My grandfather said that a jug of blackstrap molasses on the shelf and a bag of cornmeal beside it meant a fellow could feed his children through any winter the good Lord threw at him. Your one thing this week is to pour a spoonful of molasses over a hot piece of cornbread and eat it standing at the counter, the way your great-grandmother did on a cold morning in 1935. Number 16 is pemmican, and if you were with me on the last video, you already know a little about it. Pemmican is dried lean meat pounded fine on a stone, mixed 1-to-1 by weight with rendered fat, and folded together with a handful of dried berries pressed in for good measure. The Hudson's Bay Company ran the entire western fur trade on pemmican for 150 years running, and Osborne Russell carried a leather pouch of it on the 9-day stretch through Blackfoot country that we opened last week's video with. A pound of pemmican keeps for 6 months on a shelf without going bad on anybody, and it feeds a working man for 2 full days of hard travel on nothing else at all. Your grandfather knew that pemmican was the most nourishing food a body could carry into cold country by weight, because every ounce of it was pure meat and pure fat with no water to weigh it down. Cost you today about $1.50 a serving to make from scratch with grocery store beef and grocery store lard, and about half that if you make it from a deer you took yourself in the fall. My grandfather made pemmican every year of his life from the deer he shot in November, and there was always a small jar of it on the top shelf of the pantry the whole rest of the year. Your one thing this week is to look up the ratio and read it twice. Not to make it just yet, but to see how simple it actually is when a fellow understands what he is doing. Number 15 is real jerky, made with salt and smoke and thyme, and cured over a low fire the way Plains tribes had been curing it for 1,000 years before any European ever saw a buffalo. The Lewis and Clark journals from the winter the Corps spent at Fort Mandan in 1804 and 1805 described the Mandan women curing enough meat in one afternoon to feed a whole family for a full month on the strips they cut. Your grandfather knew that jerky made at home was a fraction the cost of any bag of it at a modern gas station, and that home jerky had none of the sugar and none of the chemicals that turn the store-bought kind into candy. Take a lean cut of beef, slice it thin against the grain, salt it heavy for 12 hours, and hang it over a smoldering fire of hickory or apple wood for 6 hours until the strips bend without breaking. Cost you today about $4 a pound to make from scratch at grocery store prices, and that pound will feed a hungry man for a full week if he eats it the way Eben ate it, meaning a strip or two chewed slow with a cup of hot tea between meals. My grandfather cured 5 pounds of jerky every fall of his life and gave half of it away to neighbors before Christmas came around. Your one thing this week is to slice a pound of chuck roast into strips as thin as your little finger and salt them heavy overnight, then dry them in the oven on the lowest setting with the door cracked for 6 hours. Number 14 is a whole belly of pork cured in salt and hung in a cool, dark corner of the pantry for a month, then sliced off 2 strips at a time every Sunday morning of the winter. An Appalachian family in the 1930s fed themselves through a full winter on the bacon that came off one hog they butchered in November, and the Foxfire books out of Georgia in the 1970s wrote down the salt cure ratio the exact way your great-grandmother used to know it. Take a fresh pork belly, Coat it heavy in a mixture of salt and brown sugar and a pinch of pink curing salt, and lay it in a shallow pan in the refrigerator for 7 days, turning it once a day and pouring off the liquid as it comes out. After the week is up, rinse the belly clean, pat it dry, and hang it in a cool, dark place for another 2 weeks before you slice off your first breakfast from it. Your grandfather knew that a 5-pound belly cured at home cost him about a third of what 5 pounds of grocery store bacon cost, and that the bacon he cured himself had a flavor no factory could ever match. Cost you today about 70 cents a breakfast at grocery store prices for the belly and the salt, and my grandfather cut 2 strips off the belly hanging in his pantry every Sunday morning of his life from October through March. Your one thing this week is to price out a fresh pork belly at your butcher counter and figure out how many breakfasts it would give a family of 4 before you ever pay it out. Number 13 is head cheese, or souse as some folks called it down south, and it is the honest end of the whole animal way of eating. When a hog came down in the fall of the year, nothing left the yard except the squeal, and every part of the animal had a purpose on the table before Christmas came around. The head simmered all day in a big pot on the back of the stove with an onion and a handful of black pepper and a bay leaf tossed in. Then the meat pulled clean off the bone, the broth strained and reduced, the meat chopped fine and pressed back into the broth in a loaf pan, and the whole thing set outside in the cool to gel overnight. Sliced thin on bread the next day, one hog's head fed a family of 6 for a full week of lunches for about $1 worth of scraps. The Virginia Housewife, published in 1824, has the recipe on page 127, and every Southern cookbook printed for the next 130 years carried a version of it. Your grandfather knew that head cheese was the cheapest sandwich meat on earth, and that a pig's head from the butcher cost pennies, in a time when a pound of deli ham cost real money. Cost you today about $1 a plate at grocery store prices, and free at any butcher who still sells pig's heads if you ask him nicely for one. My grandfather made a batch of head cheese every November of his life and gave a loaf pan of it to the widow across the ridge before the first snow fell. Your one thing this week is to ask your butcher what he does with the hog heads and see if he will sell you one for the same pennies your great-grandmother paid for hers. Number 12 is a suet pudding steamed in a cloth on the back of the stove for 3 hours on a cold Sunday afternoon. Suet is the hard white fat from around a beef's kidneys, and any butcher who still cuts his own meat will give you a pound of it free for the asking, because most modern customers do not know what to do with it. Your grandmother mixed a pound of suet chopped fine with 2 cups of cornmeal or flour, half a cup of molasses, a handful of dried raisins or currants, a pinch of salt, and enough milk or water to hold it all together in a stiff batter. Then she scooped the whole thing into a floured cloth, tied the corners tight, and set it in a pot of simmering water for 3 hours while the family sat in the parlor. When she pulled it out and cut it open at the table, it fed 6 people a hot filling supper for about 40 cents a serving at 1935 prices. The Foxfire Book Volume 2 has 3 separate versions of suet pudding written down from 3 separate mountain grandmothers, and every one of them made it about the same way. Your grandfather knew that suet pudding was Sunday food for a family that did not have money for a roast, and that a bowl of it warm from the pot with a spoonful of molasses over the top was as good a supper as any restaurant in the county could put on a plate. Cost you today about 40 cents a serving, and about half that if the butcher gives you the suet free the way he ought to. Your one thing this week is to ask the butcher for a pound of suet next time you are in, and see what he charges you for it. Number 11 is parched corn, which is the runner's food of the whole eastern woodlands going back 1,000 years before Europeans ever crossed the Alleghenies. A Chickasaw messenger in the 1780s covered 40 miles a day between towns on a leather pouch of parched corn at his belt, and that pouch was the entire grocery list for the trip. Dry roast whole dried corn kernels in a heavy cast iron pan on medium heat, stirring them constantly for about 10 minutes until they crack open and turn a deep amber color and smell like popcorn without popping. Salt them heavy while they are still hot, let them cool, and pour them into a jar with a tight lid where they will keep for 6 months without going bad on anybody. Your grandfather knew that parched corn was the most portable calorie in the American woods, and that a handful of it chewed slow with a swallow of water made a full meal for a working man in the middle of a long day. Cost you today about 20 cents a serving at grocery store prices for the whole dried corn, and Eben carried a small tin of parched corn in his coat pocket every day of the winter for a snack when he was out cutting wood. Your one thing this week is to buy a pound of whole dried corn at a feed store or a Mexican grocery and parch a handful of it in your cast iron and eat it warm out of the pan. Number 10 is a pot of hominy, which is dried corn soaked in wood ash lye until the tough hulls slip clean off the kernels, then rinsed until the water runs clear and simmered until the corn puffs up soft and tender. This is the process that Cherokee and Choctaw and Muskogee cooks were doing thousands of years before the first European ever set foot on this continent, and it is the same chemistry that lets tortillas exist down in Mexico today. When you soak corn in an alkali like wood ash, the corn releases niacin that your body can actually use, and it becomes a complete food that will keep a person alive by itself, where plain dried corn will slowly starve you of the very vitamins you need. Your grandfather knew that a pot of hominy with a piece of salt pork was one of the oldest suppers on the American continent, and that his grandmother had learned to make it from a Cherokee woman up the ridge before the removal in the 1830s. Cost you today about 50 cents a plate to make from scratch, and about the same at any grocery store that still sells hominy in the can. My grandfather said that a jar of homemade hominy on the shelf was a piece of American history a fellow could put on his supper table any night of the week. Your one thing this week is to look up how to nixtamalize dried corn at home with a tablespoon of pickling lime and try a small batch just to see the transformation happen in your own pot. Number 9 is a stack of buckwheat cakes off a hot griddle, poured thin and eaten with molasses or maple syrup running down the sides. German and Pennsylvania Dutch immigrants brought the buckwheat seed with them to the eastern mountains in the 1730s, and by the 1850s, buckwheat pancakes were the standard breakfast in every farmhouse from the Alleghenies down through Georgia and out into Tennessee. Buckwheat is not even a true grain, and it grows in poor, thin mountain soil where corn will not take root and where wheat will not fill out a head, and that is exactly why frontier families depended on it the way they did. Your grandfather knew that a cup of buckwheat flour mixed with a cup of buttermilk and an egg and a pinch of baking soda made 12 cakes off a hot iron griddle for about 40 cents a plate at 1935 prices, and that a stack of them with a pat of butter and a pour of sorghum was a breakfast that would run a fellow straight through until supper without a lunch in between. Cost you today about 40 cents a plate at any grocery store that still carries buckwheat flour on the shelf. My grandfather ate buckwheat cakes for breakfast every Saturday morning of his life, and Ada made them for the whole household every Saturday of that winter in the ledger. Your one thing this week is to find a bag of buckwheat flour at your grocery store and cook a stack of these cakes for your own breakfast on Saturday morning the way your great-grandmother did. Number 8 is a pot of hearty greens simmered slow with a piece of fatback for the whole afternoon on the back of the stove. Turnip greens, mustard greens, collard greens, and dandelion greens all cooked the same way, and a mess of any one of them, with a chunk of fatback dropped in the pot, fed a Southern family through the whole cold half of the year for pennies on the dollar. Your grandmother knew that greens carried more iron and more calcium and more vitamins than any bottle a modern pharmacy could sell her, and that the pot liquor left in the bottom of the pot after the greens were eaten was the most nourishing broth a body could sop up with a piece of cornbread. The Foxfire books have the whole method written down almost the way Ada made it, meaning a full pot of washed greens stemmed and torn, a quart of water, a fist-sized chunk of fatback, and 4 hours of slow simmering on the back of the stove until the greens are dark and tender and the broth has turned the color of strong tea. Cost you today about 50 cents a serving at grocery store prices, and about nothing at all if you grow the greens in your own garden or pick the dandelion out of the yard the way Ada did. My grandfather ate a mess of greens with a piece of cornbread crumbled into the pot liquor twice a week every winter of his life. Your one thing this week is to buy a bunch of collards or a bag of turnip greens at the grocery store and cook them the old slow way with a piece of salt pork and a splash of vinegar, and drink the pot liquor at the end. Number 7 is the raw white root of a cattail plant, pulled up out of the mud along any slow creek in America and eaten right there on the bank or carried home to be dried and pounded into flour. Hugh Glass ate cattail root on his crawl in 1823, and the Lewis and Clark journals from the winter the Corps spent at Fort Clatsop in 1805 and 1806 described the men eating cattail root and cattail pollen, and even the young green shoots of the plant in early spring. The cattail is the closest thing to a supermarket the American wetlands ever produced, because every part of the plant is edible in one form or another across 10 months of the year. The starchy white core of the root can be roasted like a potato or dried and pounded into flour. The young shoots can be eaten raw or cooked like asparagus. The green flower heads can be boiled and eaten like corn on the cob, and the yellow pollen in early summer makes a golden flour that turns bread the color of butter. Your grandfather knew that a fellow who could recognize a cattail in a ditch would never starve in this country, and that a single healthy patch of them could feed a whole family through a hungry stretch. Cost you today nothing at all, growing wild along every slow creek from Maine to California, and free for the taking anywhere the local rules allow it. Your one thing this week is to walk down to the nearest slow-moving water and learn to recognize a cattail on sight so you know one when you see one. Number 6 is acorns leached of their tannins in cold running water and ground into a heavy dark flour that makes bread and mush and porridge for a fraction of what any grain a fellow buys at the store would run him. California tribes like the Miwok and the Pomo ran their whole diet off acorn flour for 1,000 years before any Spanish mission ever showed up, and southeastern tribes from Georgia to Alabama did the same thing with the sweet white oak acorns that grew everywhere in those woods. Shell the acorns, chop them coarse, and soak them in cold water for 2 full days in a jar, changing the water every 8 hours until the water stops turning brown and the acorn meat no longer tastes bitter on your tongue. Dry them slow in a low oven, grind them in any grain mill or good food processor, and you have a flour that makes bread heavier and richer and more nourishing than any wheat flour on the shelf. Nessmuk mentions acorn bread in his book Woodcraft from 1884 as a food the Eastern Mountain families still made in his own time. Your grandfather knew that a good fall harvest of acorns off a single big white oak tree in the yard could feed a family a month of bread for the price of an afternoon of gathering. Cost you today nothing at all, dropping off oak trees in every park and every backyard in the eastern half of the country every October. Your one thing this week is to gather a hatful of white oak acorns off the ground this fall and try leaching a small batch of them yourself. Number 5 is a plate of yard greens picked wild off the ground your neighbor is paying somebody to spray with poison every spring. Dandelion, lamb's quarters, purslane, and young poke shoots all grow free in most American yards in the spring and early summer, and every one of them is more nourishing than half the salad greens on the shelf at the grocery store. Now the poke needs a serious word of warning here, neighbor, because poke is dangerous if a fellow does not know what he is doing with it. Only the young green shoots under 6 inches tall in early spring are safe, and even those must be boiled in 2 changes of water before they can be eaten, and the older red stalks and the roots and the berries of the mature plant are poisonous straight through. Learn poke from a person who knows poke in real life before you ever put a leaf of it in a pot. Dandelion and lamb's quarters and purslane, by contrast, are safe and simple and require nothing more than a rinse under the tap before they go in the pan. Foxfire Book Volume 2 covers all three of them with the recipes and the pictures your great-grandmother would have known cold. Your grandfather knew that Ada could feed the whole household a plate of wild greens every day of April and May and June without ever paying a penny for them. Cost you today nothing at all, growing free in every unsprayed yard and field in the country. Your one thing this week is to learn to recognize dandelion and lamb's quarters on sight, and pick a small handful of the young leaves and try them in a salad with a splash of vinegar and a strip of bacon crumbled on top. Number 4 is chicory root, dried and roasted and ground and brewed into the hot black drink that got the whole Confederacy through the Union blockade of the southern ports in 1862 and 1863. When the ships stopped coming into New Orleans and Charleston and Savannah, the coffee ran out inside a month, and the whole South learned to drink chicory in its place. Chicory is that blue-flowered weed you have seen growing in every roadside ditch in America from May through September, and the long white taproot of it is what you dig up and dry and roast and grind. Wash the root clean, chop it into small pieces, dry it in a low oven for 2 hours until it is crisp all the way through. Roast it in a heavy pan on medium heat until the pieces turn a dark chocolate brown. Grind it in any coffee grinder and brew it exactly the way you would brew coffee. Your grandfather knew that chicory tasted closer to real coffee than any decaf a grocery store has ever sold, and that a fellow could drink it strong and hot all winter long for the price of an afternoon of digging in the ditch. Cost you today nothing at all, growing free along every country road in the country, from Maine down through Louisiana. My grandfather drank chicory coffee every morning of the winter of 1935, when the real coffee ran out in November and did not come back until March. Your one thing this week is to learn to recognize the blue chicory flower along the road this summer, and try digging up a root and drying it and roasting it, just to see how close the taste comes to your morning coffee. Number 3 is a pot of hot sassafras tea in the winter and a pitcher of cold sumac drink in the summer, both of them wild and both of them free, and both of them older than any European settlement on this continent. Sassafras is the mitten-leaved tree with the root that smells like root beer when you crush it, and a piece of that root the size of your thumb, dropped into a pot of boiling water for 10 minutes, makes a hot pink tea that Cherokee and Choctaw grandmothers were serving as a spring tonic long before the first cabin was ever raised in Appalachia. Sumac is the tall bush with the fuzzy red cone-shaped berry clusters that ripen along every roadside from July through September, and a handful of those red berries steeped in a jar of cold water for 4 hours in the sun makes a tart pink drink that tastes almost exactly like fresh lemonade for none of the cost. James Mooney wrote both of them down in his study of Cherokee medicine that came out of the Smithsonian in 1891. Your grandfather drank sassafras tea every morning of the winter and sumac tea every afternoon of the summer, and Ada brewed both of them for the whole household across the whole year in the ledger. Cost you today nothing at all, growing free across the whole eastern half of the country. And a serious note on sumac before we move on. Staghorn sumac and smooth sumac with the red upright berry clusters are the safe ones, and the white-berried poison sumac that grows in swamps is the one to stay clear of and learn to tell apart on sight before you ever pick a berry. Your one thing this week is to learn the difference between the two on sight from a book or a person who knows the plants in real life. Number 2 is a sourdough starter kept alive on your kitchen counter in a mason jar, and it is not really a recipe so much as it is an inheritance. A fellow can start today and pass to his grandchildren 50 years from now. A cup of unbleached flour, a cup of water, and a clean quart jar with a cloth over the mouth of it is everything you need to begin. Stir it once a day, throw out half of it every morning, and feed it another spoonful of flour and another spoonful of water in the same amount, and in 7 days you will have a live, bubbling starter that will make you bread and biscuits and pancakes for the rest of your natural life without you ever buying a packet of dry yeast again. There are bakeries in San Francisco today that are still baking bread off a starter that came around Cape Horn in the belly of a clipper ship in the 1850s, and that starter has fed 6 generations of families without ever dying on any of them. Your grandfather knew that a sourdough starter passed from a grandmother to a granddaughter was a piece of the family that could not be bought at any store, and that a fellow who owned a live starter owned the cheapest bread in the country from that day forward. Cost of an infinite bread supply for the rest of your life, about $1 of flour to begin with. My grandmother Ada kept a starter on the back of her stove for 60 years running, and she gave a cup of it to my mother the day she married my father, and that starter is still alive on my kitchen counter today. Your one thing this week is to mix a cup of unbleached flour with a cup of water in a mason jar tonight, cover it with a cloth, set it on the counter, and feed it another spoonful of each once a day for 7 days. Give a cup of it to your daughter or your granddaughter when it is ready. That is how these things move down the years. That leaves number 1, neighbor, and it is not a meal at all. The same way the last skill in the camping video was not really a skill. It is the reason the other 21 meals on this list kept a mountain man alive, when any one of them by itself would have killed him inside a month. Picture Ada Calder standing at her stove on the morning of the 18th of December 1935, looking at a pantry that held 5 pounds of pintos, 10 pounds of cornmeal, 3 pounds of white rice, a crock of lard, a slab of salt pork, a jug of molasses, and a shelf of jars of pickled greens and cured meat that Eben had put up in September and October. Not one of those items would keep a family of 6 alive for 11 weeks by itself. A pound of pemmican a day will rot a man's gut inside 2 weeks and he will die of it. A bowl of cornmeal mush without a spoonful of lard on top is starvation with a full belly. A pot of salt pork with no greens beside it is scurvy in a barrel, and there are Union soldiers buried in Virginia today who found that out the hard way inside of a year. Any one food off this list eaten by itself for a month straight will make a body sicker at the end of the month than that body was at the start. What kept these frontier families alive was not any one food on the list. It was that every food on the list did something the other foods could not do, and put together the way your great-grandmother put them together on the table 3 times a day, they made a whole living human being out of about $2 a day. Fat from the lard and the salt pork, starch from the cornmeal and the beans, greens for the blood from the wild plants in the garden. Every one of them cheap, every one of them shelf-stable, every one of them doing a job the others on the shelf could not do on their own. A grocery cart in 2026 can hold $300 worth of food that does one thing, and that one thing is calories. A family eating out of that cart for a month will be sicker at the end of the month than they were at the start of it. Ada's pantry did 5 different things for a nickel on the dollar of what that cart costs today. That is what got lost across 3 generations, neighbor. It was not the recipes. Anybody with a phone can look up a recipe for a pot of beans in 10 seconds flat. What got lost was the architecture of it. Almost nobody left alive today under 60 knows why the beans and the cornbread and the greens and the fatback all had to be on the same table at the same meal for any of them to actually work. Your one thing this week is to pick one meal off this list, whichever one pulled at you the hardest while you were listening, and put it on your own table for supper this Sunday. Cook it the way your grandmother would have cooked it and price it out on the receipt afterward. See what $2 a plate actually tastes like when you make it with your own hands. That is where these meals come back into the world, one Sunday supper at a time. Ada set that table 3 times a day across those 11 weeks in the ledger. My father was 8 years old that winter, and he told me before he passed that he did not know until he was a grown man that the family had ever been broke. Wells, the hired boy, put on 10 pounds. And my grandmother made my father a birthday cake the 3rd of January 1936 out of cornmeal and molasses and a spoonful of lard and 1 precious egg from the hens out back. My father said it was the best cake he ever ate in his life. That is the difference between a fellow who pushes a $300 cart out of the grocery store on a Saturday and cannot tell you what he is going to eat on Tuesday, and a fellow whose great-grandmother could feed 6 mouths for 11 weeks on the money he just spent on that one cart. Tell me something down below now. Which one of these 22 meals was on your grandmother's table when you were a boy, and what did her kitchen smell like when she was cooking it? Was it the cornbread coming out of the oven on a Sunday morning, or the beans and bacon simmering on the back of the stove all afternoon, or the sourdough rising on the counter under a clean cloth? The one that shows up the most in these comments is the one I cook on camera next. Next time I have got the 3 wild teas Eben drank every morning of his life that most doctors today have never heard of, and the one common yard plant a fella has to learn to tell apart from all 3 of them before he ever drops a leaf of anything in a hot cup of water. Thanks for watching, stay safe out there, and I will see you in the next one, neighbor.